You've entered void of rules, a realm where normal constraints cease to exist. But beware, traveller, there is one rule here. You've got to hit subscribe. Seriously, it's the only rule we have. We just reached 1,000 brave souls, and we're hunting for 9,000 more to complete our dark ritual. I mean, reach our next goal, so subscribe. Or don't. But remember, the void remembers those who defy the only rule. Now let's get into today's video. I should have known something was wrong when Dolores Hartman didn't ask me a single question during the interview. Most employers want to know about your experience, your references, why you left your last job. Hell, they usually want to know if you can count change or operate basic equipment. Dolores just looked at me across her cluttered desk with those steel grey eyes that seemed to see straight through to my bones, and said, "You start tonight at 9, don't be late." The drive to the Starlight Drive-In Theatre took me through 20 miles of Indiana farmland, past rusted mailboxes and sagging barns that looked like they hadn't seen fresh paint since the Eisenhower administration. The GPS on my phone lost signal about 5 miles out, leaving me to navigate by a hand-drawn map Dolores had sketched on the back of a napkin. The roads grew narrower as I drove, paved asphalt giving way to gravel, then to dirt tracks that seemed to lead nowhere. When I finally saw the Starlight's entrance sign, I nearly drove past it. The neon letters that once spelled out the theatre's name had mostly burned out, leaving only SALGT glowing weakly in the gathering dusk. The sign itself leaned at a dangerous angle, held upright by guy wires and what looked like prayers. The Starlight Drive-In Theatre squatted on 20 acres of Indiana farmland, like some prehistoric beast that had died and been left to rot. The massive screen, 70 feet of weathered white concrete, dominated the landscape against a sky that promised storm clouds. Built in 1954, according to the faded sign, by the entrance, though it looked older somehow. Ancient, like it had been there since the land was first cleared, watching and waiting. The speaker posts rose from cracked asphalt like cemetery markers, their numbers painted in flaking white numerals that disappeared into the gathering darkness. Most of the posts had been snapped off at the base, leaving only jagged metal stumps and coils of severed wire. The ones that remained stood at odd angles, as if the earth beneath them had shifted and settled in ways that defied explanation. My car's headlights swept across row after row of empty parking spaces as I followed the access road towards the concession building. The asphalt was buckled and broken, weeds pushing through cracks in patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost like writing in a language I couldn't read. The concession stand hunched between the entrance and the screen like a bunker from some forgotten war. Its windows were dark, but I could see warm light spilling from around the edges of heavy curtains. A hand-painted sign hung crooked on the front door. Night staff entrance, employees only. Dolores met me in the parking lot, materializing from the shadows beside the building with the silence of a hunting cat. She wore the same clothes she'd had on during the interview, a faded denim jacket and jeans that looked like they hadn't been changed in days or weeks. Her keys jangled with each step, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. "You're 3 minutes late," she said, though my watch showed exactly 9 o'clock. She led me through the concession stand, her keys jangling with each step. The smell hit me immediately as we stepped inside. Burnt popcorn and something else. Something sweet and cloying that made my stomach turn and reminded me of flowers left too long in standing water. The fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered overhead, casting everything in a sickly green glow that made the peeling paint on the walls look like diseased skin. The concession stand was larger inside than it appeared from the outside, stretching back into shadows that the overhead lights couldn't quite reach. Ancient movie posters covered the walls, advertisements for films from the 50s and 60s, Their colours faded to the point where faces looked like death masks and cheerful slogans read like epitaphs. The popcorn machine sat silent in one corner, its chrome surface tarnished black with age. Next to it, a hot dog roller turned slowly despite being unplugged, its metal cylinders squeaking with each revolution. Behind the main counter, a doorway led to what Dolores called the back office. The room was cramped and windowless, filled with filing cabinets that looked like they hadn't been opened in decades. Water stains bloomed across the ceiling tiles like spreading bruises, and the air had the musty smell of old paper and older secrets. Dolores pulled a blood-red folder from her desk drawer, the kind used for important documents, though the edges were worn soft from handling and the corners were stained with something that looked suspiciously like rust. She placed it on the desk between us with the careful reverence of someone handling a holy relic. "These are the rules," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. 15 of them. Follow them exactly and you'll see morning. Break even one. She let the sentence hang in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. I opened the folder with trembling fingers. The pages inside were written in different handwritings, some in faded blue ink that looked decades old, others in desperate black scrawl that pressed so hard into the paper it had torn through in places. A few entries were written in what looked disturbingly like rust-coloured stains that flaked off when I touched them. At the top of the first page, someone had written in block letters with what might have been a child's crayon, "The Starlight Survival Guide." Rule 1, never look at the screen during dead hours, from 1:33 AM to 2:07 AM. It shows things that haven't happened yet. Someone had added a note in the margin, written in shaky handwriting. "Saw my own funeral, saw my wife remarry, saw my children forget my name, don't look." Rule 2, if you hear a 1950s radio broadcast playing, find the source and unplug it immediately. They're not from our timeline. Below this, in different ink. The broadcasts are recruiting announcements. They're looking for new employees. Rule 3, count every car that enters after midnight. If the number reaches 13, lock yourself in the projection booth until dawn. A note in red ink. 13 is when they have enough for the ceremony. Rule 4, the concession stand freezer contains more than food. If you hear tapping from inside, ignore it completely. Someone had scratched out several lines here, but I could still make out fragments. They want out, and don't let them see you listening. Rule 5. Row 13 doesn't officially exist, but if cars park there, pretend you can't see them. Rule 6. When children ask for the special movie, tell them it's not showtime yet and give them free candy to leave. A note in a child's handwriting. "We just want to watch the pictures, mister. We've been waiting so long." Rule 7. If the emergency broadcast system activates on its own, don't listen to the message. Cover your ears and count to 100. Rule 8. The janitor's closet key opens a door that shouldn't be opened. If you find yourself holding it, throw it as far as possible. Rule 9. Never serve the Starlight special popcorn after midnight. That recipe died with the original owner. Someone had drawn a skull and crossbones next to this rule. Rule 10. If someone pays with coins dated before 1954, accept the money but burn it in the oil drum behind the snack bar. Rule 11. The old playground equipment moves on its own. If you see the merry-go-round spinning, run to your car immediately. Rule 12. Security cameras show things your eyes can't see. Only check the monitors during daylight hours. A note in fading pencil. The cameras record everything, even things that aren't there. Rule 13. If a movie starts playing that's not on the schedule, let it finish. Never touch the projector controls. Rule 14. Trust no one who claims to be just passing through after 3 AM. The final rule was written in what looked like dried blood, the letters thick and uneven. Rule 15. If you see yourself on the screen, close your eyes and pray. It means your time is almost up." My hands trembled as I read the final rule, the paper feeling ice cold beneath my fingers. What kind of place is this? These rules, they sound like something from a horror movie. Dolores pulled a newspaper clipping from her desk drawer with the careful precision of someone who had performed this ritual many times before. The paper was yellowed with age and soft at the edges, but the headline was still clearly visible. Local drive-in employee found catatonic. 8th case in 5 years. The article described victims found staring at blank screens at various drive-ins across the Midwest, their minds apparently elsewhere, unable to speak or respond to stimuli. The doctors quoted in the article used terms like dissociative fugue state and complete psychological withdrawal, but their clinical language couldn't hide their bafflement. 6 employees have vanished in the past year, Dolores said matter-of-factly, as if she were discussing the weather. The rules aren't suggestions, Marcus. They're survival instructions. The last boy, Tommy Briggs, thought he was smarter than the rules. We found him 3 days later sitting in his car in row 7, staring at the blank screen. Been in the state hospital ever since. Hasn't spoken a word. She stood up and walked to a filing cabinet, pulling out a thick folder labelled Employee Records. She flipped through dozens of pages, each one bearing a photograph and basic information. Before Tommy, there was Jennifer Walsh. Before her, David Park. Before him, Rebecca Santos. All the same story. First night, followed the rules perfect, made it to sunrise. Second night, they got confident. Started thinking they understood the place. Started thinking the rules were just old superstitions. She showed me the photographs. Young faces, all of them. Hopeful, desperate. Looking for a fresh start or just trying to make enough money to get by. Looking exactly like me. What happened to them? They learned that some jobs aren't meant for the living. Dolores closed the folder and returned it to the cabinet. But you'll be different, won't you, Marcus? You'll follow the rules. She handed me a 2-way radio, its antenna bent and its plastic casing cracked, but still functional. Channel 7, emergency only. I monitor it from home, but don't expect an answer if you call. Some things you have to face alone. The emergency flashlight was a heavy metal mag light that looked like it could double as a weapon. The batteries were corroded but still held a charge. Keep this with you at all times. The overhead lights have a tendency to fail at inconvenient moments. The keys to the projection booth were brass, old enough to have developed a green patina, and they felt warm to the touch even though the building was cold. The booth is your safe room, Dolores explained. If things get bad, lock yourself in and wait for sunrise. Whatever you do, don't try to be a hero. She led me outside for a tour of the grounds before the evening show ended. The October air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the smell of dying leaves mixed with something else, something chemical and unpleasant that seemed to rise from the cracked asphalt itself. The playground equipment sat in a fenced area between the concession stand and the screen, rusted monkey bars and swings that creaked in the autumn breeze. The merry-go-round was the centerpiece, its painted horses faded to ghostly pastels. Even in daylight, there was something wrong about it. The horses' eyes seemed to follow us as we walked past, and their smiles looked more like grimaces. Built the same year as the theatre, Dolores said, noticing my stare. Owner thought families would like having something for the kids to do before the show started. Of course, that was before the accident. What accident? Little girl fell off the merry-go-round opening night, broke her neck, been trying to get back on ever since. Row 13 was exactly where it shouldn't be, between rows 12 and 14. The speaker post bore the number clearly, though it didn't appear on any of the official maps Dolores showed me. The asphalt there was darker than the rest, stained with something that had soaked deep into the porous surface. Why doesn't it exist officially? because officially there were only 12 rows when the place was built. 13 just appeared one night. County inspector came out, swore it wasn't there during the original survey, but there it was, complete with speaker posts and parking lines. Been there ever since. The projection booth perched on stilts behind the last row of cars, a wooden structure that looked like it might blow over in a strong wind. The stairs leading up to it groaned under our weight, and the door stuck so badly it took both of us to force it open. Inside, the booth was cramped and hot, filled with equipment that belonged in a museum. The projectors were massive mechanical beasts from the 1950s, all gears and lenses and chrome that reflected our faces in funhouse distortions. Film canisters lined the walls, their labels handwritten in careful script. Sunset Boulevard, The Day the Earth Stood Still, House of Wax. Do people actually come here to watch these old movies? More than you'd think. Nostalgia's a powerful thing. People want to remember when the world made sense. Dolores ran her hand along one of the projectors with something approaching affection. Of course, most of our customers aren't exactly what you'd call traditional moviegoers. She showed me the schedule for the evening, a double feature of 1950s science fiction films that would run until just before 10 p.m. Cars had already begun arriving, their headlights cutting through the gathering darkness as they navigated the maze of speaker posts and parking spaces. From the projection booth window, I watched families set up lawn chairs and blankets in the beds of pickup trucks. Teenagers clustered around cars with their radios playing, their laughter carrying across the lot like wind chimes. Children ran between the cars, playing games of tag while their parents prepared snacks and adjusted their radios to the proper frequency. It looked normal, wholesome, like a scene from a simpler time when families spent evenings together under the stars, sharing popcorn and watching stories unfold on the big screen. But as the sun disappeared behind the cornfields and true darkness settled over the starlight, I began to notice things that didn't quite fit. Cars that looked too old, too pristine, as if they'd just rolled off a 1950s assembly line. Families dressed in clothing that belonged in vintage photographs. Children who played with toys that hadn't been manufactured in decades. And all of them, without exception, faced the screen with an attention that bordered on hypnotic. No one talked during the movie. No one got up to use the restroom or buy snacks. They simply sat and stared, their faces lit by the flickering images projected onto that massive concrete rectangle. The evening show ended at 9:47 p.m. I watched from the projection booth as the last car disappeared into the cornfields, its taillights swallowed by darkness like dying stars. The silence that followed felt oppressive, like the moment before a scream. It was the kind of silence that had weight, that pressed against your eardrums and made you aware of your own heartbeat. I began my first patrol of the grounds at 10 p.m. sharp, flashlight beam dancing across empty rows of speaker posts. The maglight's beam seemed weaker than it should be, as if the darkness were actively resisting illumination. Shadows moved just beyond the circle of light, always retreating when I tried to focus on them directly. That's when I noticed speaker post 44 crackling with static, though I could see the wires had been cut years ago. The sound was wrong, not the clean hiss of modern static, but something older, more organic, like breathing or whispers just below the threshold of understanding. I approached the post cautiously, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the cracked asphalt. Up close I could see that the speaker itself was missing, leaving only a rusted mounting bracket and several feet of severed cable. But the static continued, growing louder as I got closer. Inside the concession stand, the smell of burnt popcorn had grown stronger, though nothing had been cooking for hours. I checked the popcorn machine twice, finding it cold and empty, the heating elements dark. But the smell persisted, mixed with something else now. Something like overheated electrical wiring a no zone before a storm. The security monitors flickered between normal views of empty parking rows and what looked like footage from decades past. Cars with tail fins and chrome bumpers filled the lot. Families in clothing that belonged in vintage photographs sharing blankets and thermoses under a canopy of stars. The timestamp in the corner of the screen showed the current date and time, but the images clearly came from another era. I tried adjusting the controls, thinking perhaps the system was showing archived footage, but nothing I did changed the display. The past and present seemed to exist simultaneously on those screens, overlapping like double-exposed photographs. At exactly 10 p.m, a 1950s radio broadcast filled the air. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to tonight's special engagement at the Starlight Drive-In Theatre. The announcer's voice had that distinctive crackle of old radio, all tubes and analog warmth, but underneath it lurked something else, a wet, sliding quality that made my skin crawl and my teeth ache. Tonight's feature presentation is a real spine-tingler, folks. A story of love and loss, of second chances and final chances. So, adjust your car radios to 87.5 FM. Settle back with your sweetheart, and prepare for an evening you'll never forget. Because at the Starlight, every show is a command performance, and every audience member gets to play a part. Following Rule 2, I frantically searched for the source. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the walls like trapped spirits seeking escape. I checked every radio in the building, unplugged the sound system, even yanked the batteries from my own portable radio, but the broadcast continued unabated. Finally, in the storage room, behind the snack bar, I found it. An old Zenith radio, the kind with a fabric speaker and analog dials, plugged into a wall socket that shouldn't exist. The outlet was painted over so many times it looked like a growth on the wall, a tumour of accumulated paint and time. The radio itself was in perfect condition despite its obvious age. The dial glowed warm amber, and the fabric speaker was free of the rips and stains that should have accumulated over decades of use. It looked like it had been pulled from a 1954 showroom floor and placed here moments ago. The moment I yanked the plug from the socket, the lights flickered and something heavy slammed against the freezer door. Once, twice, 3 times. Each impact sent vibrations through the floor and rattled the dishes stacked on nearby shelves. Then silence, thick and oppressive, like cotton stuffed in my ears. I approached the freezer cautiously, flashlight raised. The unit was one of those ancient chest freezers, the kind with a heavy lid that could trap a child if they climbed inside. A handwritten sign taped to the front read, "Employees only, no exceptions," in block letters that looked urgent, desperate. The freezer continued its rhythmic tapping throughout the night. Rule 4 said to ignore it, but ignoring the steady tap-tap-tap proved nearly impossible. It sounded almost like Morse code, but I didn't want to decipher the message. Some secrets were better left buried. At 11 p.m. they arrived. A pristine 1950s Buick pulled up to the ticket booth, its chrome reflecting the security lights like mirrors, catching moonlight. The car was impossibly clean for its age, as if it had been detailed yesterday instead of manufactured 70 years ago. Even the white wall tyres looked fresh from the factory. The family inside looked perfect in that uncanny valley way that made my stomach clench. Father in a Letterman jacket with chenille letters that spelled out Starlight High. Mother in a polka dot dress with a pearl necklace that caught the light like captured stars. 2 children in the back seat wearing clothes that belonged in a Norman Rockwell painting. The boy in knickers and suspenders. The girl in a jumper with her hair in perfect ringlets. But their faces were wrong. The proportions were slightly off, as if someone had tried to recreate human features from memory and gotten the details wrong. Too many teeth in their smiles. Eyes that reflected light like animals caught in headlights. When they spoke, their voices came from the wrong places. The father's words seemed to originate from somewhere behind his left ear, while the mother's voice echoed as if she was speaking from the bottom of a well. "Showtimes, please," the father said, his voice like grinding gravel mixed with distant thunder. I stammered out the information, though we were clearly closed for the night and the last show had ended hours ago. They listened with the patient attention of people who had all the time in the world, nodding at appropriate intervals and asking clarifying questions about intermission times and snack bar hours. They paid with silver coins that felt ice cold in my palm, despite the warm October night. The metal was tarnished black around the edges, and the dates stamped into the surface read 1953, 1952, 1951. Each coin felt heavier than it should, as if it were made of something denser than silver. As they drove away, I noticed they were heading toward row 13, which according to the official lot map didn't exist. But I could see the faded numbers painted on a speaker post in the shadows. 13. The numbers seemed to glow with their own pale light, like phosphorescent paint activated by darkness. Following Rule 10, I took the coins to the oil drum behind the snack bar. The drum was rusted through in places and filled with ashes that looked far older than they should. When I dropped the coins into the flames, they melted like ice cubes in hot coffee, hissing and bubbling as they dissolved. The smoke that rose smelled like burning hair and something else, something organic and sweet that reminded me of flowers at a funeral. The ashes left behind weren't silver grey, as I'd expected, but bone white and fine as talcum powder. When the wind caught them, they swirled upward in patterns that looked almost like writing in a language I couldn't read. Midnight brought my first official car count, 0 cars in the legitimate parking rows, but I could see headlights in row 13, vehicles arranged in a perfect semicircle facing the screen. Every car was from a different decade: a 1940s sedan, a 1950s convertible, a 1960s muscle car. All of them were in pristine condition, despite their obvious age, their chrome bumpers and white wall tyres gleaming in the darkness. The old playground equipment had begun to creak in the windless air. The swings moved back and forth in perfect rhythm, as if pushed by invisible children. The seesaw tilted up and down with mechanical precision, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the fence a child laughed, with the tinkling sound of broken glass. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in minutes as 1:33 a.m. approached. Dead hours, the rules called it. The most dangerous 34 minutes of every night at the Starlight Drive-In. I positioned myself in the concession stand facing away from the screen, focusing on counting candy bars and organising inventory. Anything to keep from looking at that massive blank rectangle of concrete behind me. But even facing away, I could feel the screen's presence like a weight between my shoulder blades. The hairs on my neck stood up, and the air itself seemed to thicken, becoming harder to breathe. My shadow, cast by the fluorescent lights, began to behave strangely. Instead of falling away from the light sources, it seemed drawn toward the back wall, stretching and distorting until it looked more like a reaching hand than the silhouette of a man. The screen's glow intensified behind me, though I couldn't see it directly. The light took on qualities light shouldn't have: texture and weight and the sensation of being watched by something vast and patient. Through the reflection in the concession stand's glass surfaces, I caught glimpses of impossible things playing on the screen. Scenes from my own life flickered across the concrete surface like memories made manifest. My childhood bedroom with its Star Wars posters and model airplanes. My high school graduation, cap and gown billowing in a breeze that smelled like fresh-cut grass and possibility. My first kiss with Jenny Morrison behind the gymnasium, her lips tasting like strawberry lip gloss and teenage dreams. But the scenes weren't quite right. Details were wrong, changed, improved. In the movie of my life playing on the Starlight screen, I was taller, more confident. I said the clever things I'd thought of hours later. I made the right choices instead of the ones that led me to a night job, a a haunted drive-in in rural Indiana. Then the scene shifted to darker territory. Car crashes I'd never witnessed, funerals for people I'd never met, hospital rooms where someone who looked like me lay dying while machines beeped their electronic requiems, a courtroom where I stood accused of crimes I couldn't remember committing, a prison cell with my name carved into the concrete wall. The urge to turn around became overwhelming, my neck muscles tensed against my will, fighting the conscious decision to keep facing forward. Every instinct screamed at me to look, to see what impossible movie was playing for an audience of one. I gripped the edge of the concession counter until my knuckles went white, using the pain to anchor myself to reality. I heard my own voice from the screen, older and more desperate. "Don't make the same mistakes I did, Marcus. Don't let them see you watching. The moment you turn around, you become part of the show. And the show at the Starlight never ends." The voice was followed by laughter that sounded like wind through autumn leaves. Then crying that might have been my own voice, or might have been someone else entirely. The boundary between self and other seemed to dissolve in those dead hours, leaving only the terrible certainty that I was not alone in the concession stand. At exactly 2:07 a.m, silence fell like a curtain dropping on a stage. The temperature returned to normal, and the oppressive weight lifted from my shoulders like a physical burden being removed. My shadow snapped back to its proper position, and the fluorescent lights stopped their anxious flickering. I had survived the dead hours for tonight. At 2:30 a.m, 3 children approached the concession stand. They materialized from the darkness like photographs, developing in chemical baths, their forms growing more solid with each step. They wore 1950s clothing, the boy in knickers and suspenders, the 2 girls in jumpers with their hair in perfect ringlets that defied the October breeze. Their voices sounded like breaking glass when they spoke, each word sharp enough to cut. "Can we have the special movie, mister, please? We've been waiting so long to see the special movie." Following Rule 6, I gave them free candy from the bins behind the counter. Their small hands were ice cold when they touched mine, and their skin had the waxy texture of something that had been underwater for too long. They accepted the candy with the solemn gratitude of children who understood the weight of gifts, then skipped towards the playground equipment with movements that were almost, but not quite, natural. The merry-go-round began spinning slowly as they approached, its painted horses rising and falling in the darkness. The children climbed aboard with practiced ease, settling onto horses that moved to accommodate them. As the carousel picked up speed, their laughter echoed across the empty lot, high and sweet and wrong. Remembering Rule 11, I ran to my car. The engine wouldn't start for 5 terrifying minutes, while the carousel music grew louder and more distorted. The melody started as a simple children's song, but gradually warped into something that hurt to hear. Notes bending and stretching beyond the range of human perception. When my engine finally caught, I looked back to see the children waving from their painted steeds, their faces glowing with pale light that had no source. They were still there when I reached the concession stand, still spinning, still waving, still smiling their 2 wide smiles. At 3 a.m, she emerged from the cornfield, a woman in a torn wedding dress, the fabric yellowed with age and stained with something dark that had spread across the bodice like spilled wine. Her veil hung in tatters, caught with bits of corn silk and what might have been spiderwebs. She moved with the jerky gait of a marionette, controlled by a drunk puppeteer, her feet making no sound on the gravel, despite the broken glass and debris scattered across the lot. When I looked down, I realized her feet left no prints either. The damp earth showed no trace of her passage, as if she weighed nothing at all, or as if she weren't entirely there. She approached the concession stand with purpose, her head tilted at an unnatural angle that suggested her neck might have been broken. Her bouquet was composed of flowers I didn't recognize. Pale, waxy blooms that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "I'm just passing through," she said, the exact phrase from Rule 14. Her lips were blue-black, as if she'd been underwater for hours, and when she spoke, small bubbles escaped from the corners of her mouth. "Could you tell me about showtimes, for 1954, specifically? I'm supposed to meet someone here. We have a date." I lied, saying we were closed for renovations, that there wouldn't be any shows for weeks. She listened with the patient attention of someone who had all the time in the world, her head bobbing slightly with each word as if she were hearing music I couldn't detect. "That's a shame," she said finally, her voice carrying a note of genuine disappointment. "I've been looking forward to this evening for such a long time. 69 years, 7 months, and 13 days, to be precise. But I suppose I can wait a little longer." She smiled with those purple lips, revealing teeth that were too white and too sharp, then began walking backward into the cornfield. Her movements were fluid and unnatural, as if she were being pulled by invisible strings. She never broke eye contact, even as the cornstalks swallowed her form, and her white dress disappeared into the darkness. Her form grew smaller and smaller until the stalks closed around her completely, but I swear I could still see those reflective eyes staring at me. From the shadows between the corn rows, watching, waiting, counting down the hours until some appointment I didn't want to understand. At 4 a.m, I found myself holding an old brass key I didn't remember picking up. It had appeared in my palm like a magic trick, materializing from nowhere with the weight of destiny. The metal was warm to the touch and vibrated slightly, like a tuning fork struck against stone. The brass was engraved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, and numbers that definitely read 1954. Following Rule 8, I hurled it into the darkness beyond the fence, putting all my strength behind the throw. The key tumbled end over end through the air, disappearing into the cornfield with a sound like a bell tolling in the distance. Somewhere far in the darkness, a door slammed with enough force to rattle the windows of the concession stand, though no buildings stood in that direction. The key reappeared in my pocket minutes later, colder than ice, and somehow heavier than before. This time the engravings were different, still intricate, still shifting, but now they seemed to form letters that spelled out words I didn't want to read. At 4:30 a.m, the emergency broadcast system alarm pierced the night air like a scream. The familiar tone that usually preceded weather warnings or amber alerts, but this felt different. Wrong. The sound was too loud, too sharp, cutting through the silence like a rusty knife. It seemed to come from every speaker in the building simultaneously, the radio, the PA system, even my cell phone despite having no signal. I covered my ears and began counting to 100, as Rule 7 instructed, but fragments of the message leaked through my fingers like poison seeping through a cracked container. "This is an emergency broadcast from the Indiana State Emergency Management Agency. Massive casualties have been reported at the Starlight Drive-In Theatre in rural Shelby County. First responders are on scene, but no survivors have been found. The following individuals have been confirmed deceased." My own name was the third one read. Marcus Chen, age 25, employed as night security. Cause of death appears to be sudden cardiac arrest, though preliminary examinations reveal no obvious cardiac abnormalities. The victim was found seated in the concession stand, facing away from the theatre screen, apparently having died sometime between 1:30 and 2:15 a.m. The broadcast continued with more names, more details, more impossible information about deaths that hadn't happened yet. Or perhaps deaths that had already occurred in some other timeline where I had made different choices. At exactly 100, I uncovered my ears. Normal late-night programming had returned. Some infomercial about kitchen knives hosted by a man whose smile was too wide and whose eyes never blinked. but the emergency broadcast continued to echo in my mind, the announcer's voice mixing with the knife salesman's until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. At 5 a.m, the projector roared to life without warning. The sound was like a dragon waking from centuries of sleep, all gears and motors and mechanical fury. Rule 13 forbade interference, so I watched helplessly from the concession stand as an unscheduled film began playing on the massive screen. The title card was elaborate, Art Deco lettering that seemed to move and shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. The Last Shift, a Starlight production. Below that, in smaller text, featuring Marcus Chen in his final performance. Black and white footage showed a drive-in theatre that looked exactly like the Starlight, down to the placement of every speaker post and the cracks in the asphalt. The actor playing the night attendant looked exactly like me. Not similar, not reminiscent, but identical in every detail down to the small scar on my chin from a childhood bicycle accident. The film Marcus performed my exact routine with uncanny precision. He checked the same inventory I had checked, counted the same cars I had counted, even had the same nervous habit of checking his watch every few minutes. The movie showed everything I had done that night in perfect detail, as if it had been filmed in real time by invisible cameras. But the film continued past the present moment, showing scenes that hadn't happened yet. I watched myself complete the rest of my shift, survive until sunrise, meet with Dolores for debriefing. The movie Marcus looked relieved, exhausted but triumphant. He had followed the rules and lived to tell about it. Then the scene shifted. The movie Marcus was offered a second night. In the film, I watched myself accept eagerly, confident now that I understood the rules. The second night started the same way. The same routine, the same supernatural encounters, the same careful adherence to the 15 commandments that kept employees alive. But on the second night, the movie Marcus made a mistake. It was subtle, barely noticeable. While organising inventory during the dead hours, the film version of myself glanced at the security monitors. Just a quick look, he told himself, just to make sure everything was normal. But Rule 12 was explicit. Only check the monitors during daylight hours. The moment movie Marcus looked at the screens, his face went slack. His eyes widened until they showed white all around the irises, and his mouth opened in a silent scream that went on and on. The cameras showed him things no living person should see. The true nature of the Starlight Drive-In. The real reason for the rules, the fate that awaited those who looked too deep into the theatre's secrets. When the scene ended, movie Marcus was gone. Only his clothes remained, scattered across the concession stand floor like the shed skin of some impossible creature. The film flickered and went dark, leaving the real me standing in darkness that felt suddenly much more oppressive. The projector continued running, but now it showed only white light, pure blank illumination that hurt to look at directly. Somehow that empty brightness was more terrifying than anything I had seen all night. At 5:30 a.m, I began my final car count of the night. 12 vintage vehicles sat in the lot that hadn't been there during my last check. Each car was from a different decade, a rolling museum of American automotive history, a 1940s Packard with suicide doors, a 1950s Cadillac with fins like rocket ships, a 1960s Mustang with racing stripes, a 1970s Lincoln Continental that looked like a land yacht. All of them were in pristine condition, despite their obvious age, their chrome bumpers and white wall tyres gleaming in the pre-dawn darkness. They were arranged in a perfect semicircle facing the screen, like supplicants before an altar. A 13th vehicle approached from the access road, its headlights cutting through the morning mist that had begun to rise from the surrounding cornfields. As it drew closer, I could see it was a black hearse from the 1950s, its chrome gleaming despite the rust that should have claimed it decades ago. The vehicle moved with the smooth silence of a shark through dark water. Following Rule 3, I raced to the projection booth and locked the door behind me. My hands shook as I turned the deadbolt, and the brass key grew warm in my fingers, as if responding to my fear. Through the window, I watched the hearse park in row 13, taking its place among the other vehicles, like the final piece of an infernal puzzle. The driver stepped out with movements that defied human anatomy. His limbs bent at wrong angles, and his head rotated a full 180 degrees to look directly at the projection booth. He wore a chauffeur's cap tilted at a jaunty angle, and his uniform was immaculate despite being older than anyone alive. When he waved at me, I could see that his hand was nothing but bones, held together by rotting tendons and sheer malevolent will. He smiled with a mouthful of too many teeth, each one filed to a sharp point, then tipped his cap in a gesture of mock courtesy. Behind him, the doors of all 13 vehicles opened simultaneously, and figures began emerging. Men in Letterman jackets and women in polka dot dresses, children in knickers and jumpers, all of them from different eras, all of them wrong in ways that made my eyes water to look at them directly. They formed a line facing the projection booth, standing at perfect attention like soldiers, awaiting orders. The chauffeur raised his skeletal hand, and as one, they began to applaud. The sound echoed across the empty lot like gunshots, rhythmic and relentless. They were applauding me. Sunrise began at 6 a.m., painting the sky in deceptive beauty. The vintage cars began to fade like mirages in the growing light, becoming translucent and then disappearing entirely. The figures dissolved with them, leaving only the chauffeur, who continued his slow applause until he too vanished with the last shadows of night. I felt overwhelming relief as daylight conquered the darkness, sunlight streaming through the projection booth windows like a benediction. The normal world was returning. I could hear birds singing in the distance and the rumble of farm equipment starting up for the day's work. The nightmare was over. I called Dolores to report a successful first night, but when she answered, her voice sounded strange, distant and hollow, as if she was speaking from the bottom of a deep well. "Good luck with your final hour, Marcus." The line went dead before I could ask what she meant. I checked my phone. No signal, which was strange because I'd had full bars when I arrived the night before. The display showed the time as 6:15 a.m., but something about the numbers looked wrong. They flickered and shifted, sometimes showing military time, sometimes showing symbols I didn't recognize. Exhausted and seeking some small comfort, I made a decision that would doom me. It was daylight now, broad and honest and normal. The supernatural encounters of the night felt like fever dreams in the face of morning sunshine. Rule 12 said only to check the monitors during daylight hours, and it was definitely daylight now. I descended from the projection booth and walked to the concession stand, my footsteps echoing strangely in the empty building. The security monitors were arranged in a bank along the back wall, their screens dark and reflective like dead eyes. I flipped the power switch and one by one, they flickered to life. At first, they showed exactly what I expected. Empty parking rows, the massive screen standing sentinel in the morning light, the playground equipment still and normal. But as I watched, the images began to change. The screen showed the drive-in as it existed now, but also as it had been in 1954. The two timelines overlapped, like double-exposed photographs, past and present, existing simultaneously. I watched the grand opening night, families celebrating under a canopy of stars, children playing on playground equipment that was bright and new, couples sharing popcorn and dreams in cars that smelled of fresh upholstery and possibility. Then I saw the accident, a gas leak in the concession stand, invisible and odorless, a spark from faulty wiring in the projection booth, the explosion that turned celebration into catastrophe, trapping dozens of people in their cars as walls of flame blocked every exit. The emergency vehicles that arrived too late, the bodies that were never recovered, the official report that blamed equipment failure and recommended the theatre be demolished. But the Starlight hadn't been demolished. It had been rebuilt, reopened, staffed with a succession of night attendants who all eventually discovered the same terrible truth. The theatre existed in multiple timelines simultaneously, a wound in reality that never healed. The monitors showed more than just the past. They revealed the true nature of the Starlight's customers. The families who attended shows were the same families who had died in 1954, forever trapped in the moment before tragedy struck. They returned night after night, seeking something they could never find, watching movies that always ended the same way. And they weren't alone. The screens showed the employees too, every night attendant who had worked at the Starlight since its reopening. Tommy Briggs was there, and Jennifer Walsh, and David Park, and Rebecca Santos. All the names from Dolores's files, all the faces from the employee photographs. They stood in row 13, still wearing their work uniforms, still carrying their flashlights and radios. They waved at the camera, with movements that were almost, but not quite, human. And among them, I saw myself. Not the movie version of myself, but the real Marcus Chen, wearing the same clothes I was wearing now, standing in the same spot where the chauffeur had been. My face on the monitor was pale and drawn, my eyes reflecting light like an animal's. I was smiling, but it was the wrong kind of smile, too wide, showing too many teeth. The terrible truth crashed over me like ice water. The Starlight Drive-In had been closed since 1954. The building I stood in, the job I had accepted, the rules I had followed, none of it was real in any conventional sense. The theatre existed in a state of temporal flux, forever replaying the events of its opening night while recruiting new souls to join its eternal audience. Every employee who lasted through their first night became part of the cycle. They weren't protecting themselves from the supernatural inhabitants of the Starlight. They were being tested, evaluated, prepared for recruitment. The rules weren't survival instructions, they were an examination. Those who followed them perfectly demonstrated the discipline and attention to detail needed to become eternal employees. Those who broke the rules simply disappeared, erased from reality as if they had never existed. But those who proved themselves worthy were offered a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Join the staff permanently or face complete obliteration. At 6:45 a.m, the massive screen flickered to life one final time. I saw myself standing in the concession stand, but it wasn't a reflection. The screen was showing me in real time, broadcasting my image to an audience of the dead. This was Rule 15, the final warning, the last chance to close my eyes and pray. But it was too late for prayer. The Marcus on the screen moved independently, approaching the camera with jerky, unnatural movements. His face was my face, but the expression was wrong, hungry and predatory, in ways human faces shouldn't be. "Welcome to the Starlight," my reflection said, with a voice like grinding metal and autumn wind. "We've been waiting for you, Marcus. We've been waiting for someone exactly like you." I tried to step away from the monitors, but my feet wouldn't obey. My body had become a puppet controlled by strings I couldn't see. The reflection continued speaking, its words echoing in the empty concession stand. "The job comes with excellent benefits, eternal employment, perfect job security, and the opportunity to help others find their true calling. All you have to do is sign the contract." A piece of paper materialized on the concession counter, an employment agreement written in flowing script that seemed to move and shift when I tried to read it directly. The terms were simple: permanent employment at the Starlight Drive-In Theatre in exchange for my soul, my freedom, and my humanity. Previous employees have found the work very fulfilling. The screen markers continued. Ask Tommy Briggs, ask Jennifer Walsh, ask any of them. They'll tell you that working here is the opportunity of several lifetimes. I felt my consciousness splitting, like a cell dividing. Part of me remained in the concession stand, terrified and desperate to escape. But another part was being drawn toward the screen, pulled into whatever dimension the Starlight actually occupied. The boundary between self and other began to dissolve, leaving only the terrible certainty that I was no longer alone in my own mind. The Marcus in the booth began to fade as the Marcus on the screen grew more solid. My reflection stepped out of the monitor like someone walking through a doorway, becoming three-dimensional and impossibly real. He extended a hand that was my hand but wasn't, offering a pen that gleamed like polished bone. "Sign the contract, Marcus. Make it official. Join the team." My hand moved without my permission, fingers closing around the pen. The metal was warm. It seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. I could feel the weight of destiny in that simple writing instrument, the accumulated expectations of decades of previous employees who had made the same choice. As the pen touched the paper, I understood the final truth about the Starlight Drive-In. This wasn't just a haunted movie theatre or a supernatural trap. It was a processing centre, a way station for souls caught between life and whatever came after. The 1954 disaster had torn a hole in reality, creating a space where the normal rules didn't apply. The theatre fed on dreams and memories, sustaining itself through the psychic energy of its victims, but it needed fresh souls to maintain the illusion. New employees to keep the machinery of death and rebirth functioning. Every night attendant who lasted until dawn became a recruiter tasked with finding and training their own replacement. I signed my name in letters that burned as they appeared on the paper. The moment the ink dried, I felt something fundamental change inside me. My heartbeat slowed, then stopped entirely. My breathing became shallow, then ceased altogether. I was still conscious, still aware, but the Marcus Chen who had arrived at the Starlight the night before was gone forever. At 7 a.m, Dolores arrived to find the concession stand empty. My car was gone from the parking lot, my personal items vanished, as if I had never existed. The security footage would show me leaving at 6:50 a.m, smiling peacefully and waving goodbye to cameras that shouldn't have been able to record someone who was no longer technically alive. But Dolores knew better. She had performed this ritual dozens of times before, would perform it dozens of times again. She checked the old employee records, finding my name already added to a list dating back to 1954. The supernatural bureaucracy of the Starlight was nothing if not efficient. She updated the job posting on various employment websites. Night attendant needed, no experience necessary, flexible hours, competitive wages, opportunity for advancement. Apply in person at the Starlight Drive-In Theatre, 2847 County Road, 450, Shelbyville, Indiana. Ask for Dolores. The listing would attract the desperate, the broke, the people with nowhere else to turn. It always did. There were always people in rural Indiana looking for work, willing to ignore red flags in exchange for a steady paycheck and the promise of something better. The Starlight Drive-In continues its eternal show, where the audience never leaves and the movie never truly ends. Every night, the 1954 disaster replays in perfect detail. The employees are actually victims, forever trying to prevent others from discovering the truth, while simultaneously recruiting them to join the endless cycle. The theatre feeds on hope and desperation in equal measure, sustaining itself through the dreams of people who believe they can escape their circumstances through hard work and careful attention to the rules. It offers them exactly what they want: a job, security, purpose, and extracts payment in the only currency that truly matters. I watch from row 13 now, my smile too wide, my eyes reflecting light in the darkness. I wave at each new worker, with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loves his job. I hope they'll be smart enough to break the rules and escape knowing they won't. The hunger of the Starlight must be fed, and there are always desperate people looking for work in rural Indiana. Tonight's applicant is a young woman named Sarah, 22 years old and fresh out of college with a degree that proved worthless in the current job market. She needs the money for student loans, rent, basic survival. She'll follow the rules perfectly because she has to, because she has no other choice. I'll be watching from the screen when her time comes, waiting to welcome her to the team. The Starlight Drive-In is always hiring, always looking for dedicated employees who understand the value of following instructions and the importance of customer service. After all, in the entertainment business, the show must go on, and at the Starlight, the show never ends.